it felt you. Welcome to the Village Oak Tree. And this show is for October 9th, 2024. I'm your host, Terrence O'Donnell, and I thank you for joining me once again. This week, my guest is Steve Brigham, an author of It's Never Been a Level Playing Field. And we're going to talk about the race issue in the United States, and to a lesser degree, Great Britain, because that's kind of where it came from. So with that, let me introduce you to Mr. Steve Brigham here, and let's get into today.
All right, Terrence.
So first of all, I'm going to do is tell us about your book. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up this screenshot of your book off your website here.
Okay.
So this is what it looks like. This is where you can find it. And I'll let you talk about it.
All right. So, Terrence, it's an interesting story, right? So I began writing and not intending to write a book right as the pandemic began in 2020. And I wrote literally every day for a year, and I had completed a manuscript. And I shopped it around, and it was really, really long. And I was told it's got to have more shape to it. It's got to be more focused, more cohesive. So I spent the next 3 years rewriting it completely, and just finished it this past summer. So it's clearly a labor of love. As you said, it's never been a level playing field. I love the cover because I think it depicts exactly what I'm trying to convey throughout the book. And this cover was actually conceived by my fiance, who's African American, and I thought she did a brilliant job of coming up with this idea and then having a graphic artist bring it into reality. But so the interesting thing is, the book covers 8 different myths that I feel like I have come across in my years as an adult since the 80s, from having lived in Washington, D.C. region since 1988, married to an African-American woman, have 2 biracial kids, live in a majority Black county, and throughout this entire time, just continuing to scratch my head around why is it not a level playing field, and with a lot of people claiming that it actually is.
Yeah.
And so I never had a really great, compelling argument to counter with, at least at a comprehensive level. So this journey I took to write the book was really to understand the history in a way that I'd never understood it before, obviously going back to slavery, but every decade since the Civil War ended, right? What did we do to blacks when slavery ended? Not much. Then we created Jim Crow laws around for 100 years. Then we did the Civil Rights Acts, but we didn't really fundamentally change much at all.
Nope.
And so I learned the history much more deeply, understood better all the legal and cultural structures kind of behind it all through that time, tracked attitudes of whites even since the 60s around, well, what is the problem, with blacks, with Africa? Why can't they? Why now that it's an even playing field? Why can't they do the same thing as whites do? Right. So the book really was to try to dispel and explode a bunch of myths around blacks can live wherever they want, around their poor health outcomes, environmental injustice, the quality of schools so many of them go to, and the fact that the segregation of schools is not that much different from the 50s and 60s when you look at where children go to school these days. Discrimination in our economic sector. So, and obviously the one I think that everyone's acutely aware of, the disparities in how justice is meted out between blacks and between whites. So this was my journey to really understand it myself, to explain it, articulate it. And then I spent the last part of the book really saying, so if we now understand how unlevel the playing field remains and how unfair the system has continued to be, what if we really wanted to repair the damage done over several hundred years, what are the kinds of transformative policies that we can consider across all the spheres, whether it's housing and zoning, neighborhoods, schools, the economy, investment in entrepreneurship, changing how we police neighborhoods, changing how the court systems work, et cetera, et cetera. So I try to be as comprehensive as possible, and especially with the solutions as provocative as possible, knowing that, you know, getting a whole lot done in America in 2024, you know, it's a quagmire to try and get stuff, really important stuff done.
So let's kind of talk about that a little bit. So I'm gonna pull your book down.
Okay.
Um, and let's talk about that a little bit. So I mean, you just went off on a whole lot of things, and
Right.
that's actually very good. Okay. So I kind of want to do a little bit of a deep dive in some of this stuff. So going back to, I mean, I've done a lot of history, reading myself, especially the last couple of years. So as we know, the first slaves showed up in Jamestown about 1620, 1621, on board a privateer. And all he cared about was trading a commodity for a bunch of water and food.
Right.
Uh, they were just objects, okay, something to be sold, or traded, so on and so forth. And it kind of jumped from there. Um, my whole thing with history is that the European colonists at that time were not European; they were British. Okay,
At least in the
Puritans
Americas, primarily,
in the
yes.
Americas. Well, that's in the 1620s, what we now call the United States was all a couple of British colonies, one up in Boston, the Plymouth Rock, and the one at Jamestown. Okay, um, the Spanish and the French had a big toehold on the southern, the southern stretch, going out towards Texas. The Spanish had the rest of it going out west. The French had the north, what we know as Quebec and the
Quebec,
Atlantic
yeah.
Maritimes. So, the British were just getting a toehold here in this part of the continent. And for them, it was all about once they got their foothold in the first decade, they started making inroads into all the Indian villages and tearing them up, taking slaves there, sort of. It wasn't quite the same way when they brought the Africans, but slavery was starting to get an uptick to a degree because the Jamestown settlers were running around out there in the woods and capturing indigenous people and bringing them back and making them work. Not a lot, a handful or so, but still, it kind of got its start. But then, once the first Africans showed up, it was the door got busted wide open, and as we know, history took off from there. So the big thing is, I think a lot of it, even in the last 400 years, the issue with African Americans, in just in the start, they were just Africans. When the Civil War was over and they were crafting the Constitution, what did they say about the African Americans? They were still considered Africans because they were largely slaves. Some of them had been freed. Some of them had made it up to the north, made it to Canada, and they were all on paper basically free. But what did the Constitution say? They're only considered three-fifths of a man when it comes to voting. Okay, so that tells you something right there. So,
Right.
irregardless of whether they were running around in shackles on some plantation in the South or living as a so called free man in Boston, they were still only considered three-fifths of a person as far as voting, property rights, and all the things that
The
go with
census, right?
it. Yeah, all that.
What
Yeah,
what
exactly.
what dollars the states got? Yep.
Yeah. And so my premise with all of that is that truthfully, very, despite getting rid of the on paper three-fifths, you know, measure, they're still being treated like they're only three-fifths of a citizen. Okay. And this goes back to what you're saying in modern times. where they're being marginalized in where they live. They're being marginalized on where they can work, marginalized pretty much throughout society. And this is one of the things that to talk about with this CRT, which I've talked to other people about that as well, is that this systemic racism that's deeply embedded in American culture, and I say American, it's not just United States because the Canadians have it as well. Okay, but you might as well say North America. But the systemic racism in North America is, it's part of the culture, and the roots are very deep. I would say that it would be really, really hard to uproot them right now and make things an equal level playing field, as your book alludes. So, what do you think about this? You know, what I'm saying about systemic racism.
So, I mean, yes, the roots go that far back for sure. I mean, the interesting thing is back during the 1600s, a lot of indentured servants were coming over from the United Kingdom, right?
Yep.
Especially Irish, Scottish, but also some Welsh and other English that had to pay off debts.
Right.
And it wasn't really, they worked side by side with the Africans that were brought over.
Mm-hmm.
But very quickly the terms changed, and the indentured servants were able to kind of uh, live out their sentence and become free, whereas very few Africans during the 1600s were able to do that. And pretty
Right.
soon it became codified into Virginia state law that they would be enslaved in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it goes that far back. The Constitution didn't change it a whole lot, even though yes, there were free African Americans in the North. Although the interesting thing that I found out during my research, probably most people don't know this, but certainly people who pay attention do. There were slaveholders up in the North too,
Oh yeah.
throughout all the states, right?
Yep.
One person, two people, a few people living in the household, living in the hut in the backyard or whatever, but not at the scale of the South. But yes, there were a lot of free blacks in a number of the northern colonies. But yeah, even after the Civil War, it didn't change much. A lot of African Americans had to move into sharecropping, where it was a very intentionally unfair system
Mm-hmm.
by the landowners.
Well,
And then
a lot
a
of
lot
poor
of poor
white people
whites
got.
too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that's another part of American history too, right? It's like where in this case, whites and blacks should have common cause. Poor whites and blacks should have that our political system and the strategic politicians in our system saw the possibility that poor people across race and ethnicity could band together. They
Mm-hmm.
always looked for using the race card to continue to divide.
Right.
And for poor whites, well, at least you're above the poorer blacks, right? So
Well, that was the premise. Yeah.
that was the premise, right? So yeah, it has continued when African Americans moved up north to escape white terrorism in the South. They were confined to ghettos, right?
Mm-hmm.
Intentionally created ghettos that were divested in, and they had to live, for many decades in slum or virtual slum conditions
Right.
with very few prospects for getting out. So
Right.
so even though they got freedom from the sharecropping system and the KKK and what have you, they were subjected to very severe discrimination and oppression up north as well, and the Midwest and the West.
Oh yeah.
So it wasn't really, we didn't kind of legally release those shackles until the 60s. And there was a real opportunity, especially in the late 60s with the Kerner Commission, if we had followed their recommendations of
Mm-hmm.
of really transforming things economically, socially, culturally, housing wise, whatever the case may be, and we didn't.
No.
So it's been very incremental improvement along most of the lines, and yes, it is a more level playing field than it was in 1964 or 1968. But fundamental things have not changed in it, and
No.
the level playing field therefore remains on level.
No. And you're absolutely right. The big thing is a lot of people don't want to change. Okay. Um, I've lived all over the country, and I lived in a lot of countries overseas too. And so the big thing I've noticed here in the United States, and if you look at it from an outsider's point of view, is that the only real parallels is Great Britain and the United States. Okay. Now, if you go to, go to European countries, it doesn't really matter the color of your skin there. If you try really hard to assimilate in places like France, well, I say France only because the French, they're okay with you coming there as long as you mold yourself to be a Frenchman. Okay. They don't care about the color of your skin as long as you turn yourself into French. Okay. So that's one of the things that's causing a lot of ripples in France. Spain, they're a little bit different. They don't really care either. They don't really care if you conform so much as long as you don't start up any trouble. They're all about everybody living in peace, and that's great. Germany was always very welcoming up until recently, and I say it has little to do with the color of people's skin over there. It's all about attitudes. Um, again, Germany said, we'll welcome you as long as you don't start any trouble. But you start trouble, then we don't like you anymore. And you can see what's going on over there as we speak. And a lot of other countries are basically saying the same thing, that one, there's too many of you, you need to stop. And two, when you get here, you need to behave yourselves. If you can't do that, well, you're not welcome anymore. So Europe is having a big issue with that. Each little nation state over there has got a little bit different issues on how they're handling it. Some good and some not so good. The United States, on the other hand, and Great Britain to a large degree, they've never really wanted to assimilate anybody. Okay. Now, granted, Great Britain got stuck with it until Brexit, with accepting all of these refugees, because one, Great Britain had the greatest welfare system, and that's why they were all these immigrants and refugees up until Brexit and a little bit after, were flocking to England like moths to a light. Okay, because they were all about all the benefits they could get. So obviously the welcome mat's been withdrawn, and Britain is going through a huge upheaval right now for all of that. But again, it goes back to white supremacy over there. It's always been white supremacy, or for like 500-600 years, or maybe even more. And so it's coming to the fore again over there because of all this stuff. The United States is broader. They were accepting for the longest time, but with the United States, it was all about, well, we only like certain people. Okay.
Right. I mean, until the 1960s, you couldn't come here unless you had white skin. Essentially, most of the immigrants were Western and Eastern European.
Right. Well, there's the other part of that too. My own ancestors. I'm not that far removed from the old sod, but my ancestors ran into that as well because they were Irish Catholic and they were not welcome. Then that was the other part of it. It goes back to what you were saying. It doesn't really matter about your economic status here in the United States, but if you were a descendant of white Europeans and a Protestant, no problem. You want to come here, we'll welcome you with open arms, help you out, do whatever you want. But if you're darker skin and you're Muslim or a Catholic, oh no, yeah, the welcome mat's not so great anymore. And as we saw after 9/11, the Muslims in this country had the mat jerked right off from underneath them, and it's been that way ever since. We got guys like Donald Trump who really jerked the mat out.
Or tried, yep.
Yeah, tried really hard. So we may go back to that. Who knows? But the upshot is that the United States has always had a kind of a dodgy relationship with immigrants. Because again, it depends on your religious faith, the color of your skin, your economic status, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's different kind of pathways to assimilation in immigrant history, right?
Right.
And the most difficult pathway over our entire history has been for African Americans and Native Americans.
Yes.
With
Yeah.
African Americans, it was, keep them on the farm or keep them in the ghettos. With the Native Americans, it was take away their land and put them in reservations.
Right.
The Irish that came over, the Italians that came over, the Norwegians that came over, the Jews that came, eventually they were more and more accepted into mainstream American society, but not the case with the Native Americans in Africa.
Well, the big thing is, like, the Irish, when they came over, they were basically forced out of Ireland, in the early 1800s and throughout.
Right.
And when they arrived in North America, the Canadians accepted them without any trouble at all. Okay. And that's where my Irish ancestors came through. They didn't come to the United States. They went to Canada. Okay. A lot of people don't know that Dartmouth, Nova Scotia was the Canadian version of Ellis Island.
Okay? Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
No, I didn't know that.
But the other part of that is that, by and large, whether they were Irish, Italian, or anything in between, if you're a Catholic coming in the United States back in the 19th and early 20th century, you were not welcome very much. And again, it goes back to what happened to them. Basically, they were relegated to boroughs. Now that they call them boroughs in New York, in Boston, and other big cities. Chicago was the same way. Once they started making their way out west, the big cities basically segregated everybody and said, you can do this, you can do that, but no, you can't do this, you can't do that. New York, in part of it, was because at one time in the early 1800s, the Irish basically took over New York City. The old stories of Tammany Hall and the corrupt Irish politicians there. And a lot of that, be honest with you, in New York City is still pervasive throughout their, institutions there. The Irish,
elements of that in Boston too.
Yeah, in Boston as well. Exactly. In Boston as well. There's still a lot of that institutionalized, how do you call it? Fraternity, if you will, where it seems like in New York and Boston, Chicago, Irish seem to have a better leg up on getting into firehouses and police stations to go to work than other folks, and it's been 150 some years. So some things don't change. But, you get back to the African Americans, they obviously were treated the same way. And I lived for a while. I lived in a place called Clinton, Tennessee, up in the northeast part, just north of Knoxville, Tennessee. And that town was extremely segregated. Okay. The African Americans were told, you're only allowed to live in this section of neighborhood in this part of town. We're not going to allow you to live anywhere else. You're not allowed to mix with anybody, so on and so forth. I mean, they were, extremely segregated, but yet they got away with it. And this is the 1990s.
Yeah.
Okay. And Knoxville was a little bit better to a degree, but at the same time, there was a noted segregation there where African Americans were basically pushed to one part of town, and it was run down, less taken care of, and so on and so forth. And it's been like that pretty much everywhere in the United States. Everywhere I've ever been, it seems like whenever you have any type of middle to large city, it's basically divided like that, where you have a section of, like, Southside Chicago, for example. Los Angeles has its sections, and so on and so forth. And it's like, well, you know what? Why can't we all just learn to get along? So let's go back to, you talked earlier about these 8 and this. So give us kind of some details about that.
Yeah, sure. So, the first chapter I call the overarching myth, and the overarching myth, it's that we do have a level playing field. And what I recount is, if you look through every single sector in the 2020s, it's still the leadership is still dominated by whites, whether that's in government or private, just about every sector of private industry, in the nonprofit world, in the philanthropy world, in the media world. It's dominated by whites at the level of 80 to 90 to 100% white. So it's like, if we have a level playing field, how is it that 60 years after civil rights, you're still seeing that kind of domination and supremacy in all these different sectors, right?
Yeah.
The second and third myth are what I call the where we live myths. The first one is that Black people can live wherever they want, basically. And as we know, that's a lot more true than it was 60 years ago.
True.
But there's still a lot of local zoning laws, for example, that limit the kind of housing that can be built in these jurisdictions. And so so white towns that are middle to upper middle class, they restrict anyone who doesn't have that kind of income or wealth.
Yeah.
Can't build multifamily housing, can't build, in some cases, can't build townhouses, can't build apartment buildings. And because even 60 years later, African Americans still have a quite a bit lower household income, they can't afford necessarily to move out to neighborhoods and buy the half-acre plot in the 3,000 square foot house. Now, a lot more can now than 50, 60 years ago, but there has been an intentional prevention of, well, we don't want a certain element in our town, so we're going to write the zoning laws accordingly, right? And it used to be much more explicit around racial covenants, where it's like, you can't even, as a white person, you can't sell your house to a Black person or a person of color. Right.
Yeah, I remember that.
And there, although those are now outlawed, there are still racial covenants on the books locally, right? And the town I live in, Bowie, Maryland, had racial covenants, and it wasn't until a lawsuit occurred in the early 70s that was completely undone. And Bowie back then, at least in the all the central business and residential district, was all white.
Yeah.
So and so if you're Black, or if you're an immigrant of color, or whatever the case may be, it's like, yeah, maybe now I can live there, but do I want to? Am I going to be subjected to bigotry and prejudice and bias? And so so it's not the same choice that white people have. And if you look at residential patterns, and if you look at national surveys, whites will tell you they'd much prefer to live in a white neighborhood, or at least a predominantly white neighborhood. Or if you ask African Americans, they say they want to live in diverse neighborhoods. But diverse, whites tend to define diverse as, 10 to 20% other, 80 to 90% white. African Americans define diverse as, 50% white, 50% Black, Latino, Asian, what have you, right? So that we're not even using the same terminology to describe what people are looking for. So there's the whole legacy and history of segregation. And, you still have cities like Washington, D.C., near where I live, where the two poorest wards are 90 to 95% African American, and with much higher unemployment, and with much higher rates of poverty. And, a lot of white people would say, well, they should just move out. Well, in Washington, D.C., moving out, housing is incredibly expensive here.
Yeah.
You want to find a studio apartment somewhere else in Washington, D.C., $1,500 a month, $1,800 a month, $2,500, but even out in the suburbs, it's the same thing. So if you are limited in income, then you end up being stuck in these high poverty neighborhoods, even if you want to leave, right? So there's all kinds of, and all that goes back to how we decided to create the ghettos in the first place, and disinvest in, limited. If you go to any major city in America today, right, and you want to find the highest poverty neighborhoods, they're the same neighborhoods that were ghettoized back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? Now it may not all be African American, maybe Latino or a mix or what have you, Asian American sometimes, but it's and those neighborhoods really haven't been invested in ever, right? So that's, and then the second myth around where we live is that, the reason why there are health disparities in America is because, those are, again, our choices that Black people make. But if you look at environmental racism that dates back to the 20s. Where did we put polluting facilities? Where do we put hazardous waste facilities? We put them next to low income, predominantly black neighborhoods in
Yep.
or outside of cities. Also, other places where poor white people live too,
Yep.
Native Americans live,
Yep.
but had the biggest impact because of it being urbanized on black people, and so they live cheek by jowl next to these polluting facilities. Still happens today. Where did we put the highways in cities? We put them right
Right
straight
through.
through black
Mhm.
neighborhoods and
Yep.
split them up, right? And kind of decimated their communities and didn't help relocate them. And so a lot of them have had to stay, and now they're living with a new source of pollution, right?
Mhm.
So blacks are exposed to higher levels of lead. They have higher rates of asthma. They have, a whole range of health maladies because of where they live.
Yeah.
And on the other side of that is where a lot of African Americans end up having to live. They're healthcare deserts, or what I call
Yeah.
healthcare apartheid. There are food deserts or food apartheid.
Mhm.
You drive, like in Ward 7, where I've done some work. There's like two supermarkets in the entire ward of 180,000 people. You go over to Ward 3, which is predominantly white, they've got 17 supermarkets.
Yeah.
And if you're living in Ward 7, you're less likely to have a car. More likely to be reliant on public transportation, which is not always great, and which does
Mhm.
not always take you to where you need to go. So,
Yeah.
there's all kinds of reasons and again, this is a legacy of segregation and clearly a
Mhm.
legacy of racism and discrimination. So each of the chapters, I try to, this idea that we have, that everybody has the same opportunity for good jobs, starting a business, what
Yeah.
have you. Not true.
Not true.
That everyone has the same educational opportunity. Again, a lot of this is a legacy of segregation, where economic opportunity is versus where people live, where the good schools are versus where people live. So the segregation and the legacy of it kind of continues across all these myths.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I think in this case, the United States has got a big problem between the haves and have-nots. The wealth gap is getting seriously wide in this country. And
For sure.
again, a lot of this stuff goes back to what we were talking about from like the 19th century, where the elites back then deliberately separated like a social strata. Okay, so the lowest part of the social strata was the slaves. Okay,
Right. Hmm.
then the next leg up were the poor white sharecroppers. And and I say that because they were the next level above, simply because the rich people wanted it that way. Okay, they wanted the poor whites to basically be on the same economic strata as the slaves, but they said, well, we're not going to give you anything extra, but we'll treat you just a little bit better. That means that you now have a little bit of authority over these black people because they're slaves and you're not. Okay. But your life though is not really going to be any better. We're just going to kind of make you a little bit different. You know what I mean? And so that's a whole thing with after the Civil War, this business with the sharecroppers. And a lot of these plantation owners lost it all during the Civil War, and so everything got split up. But sharecropping and all that never really went away. It just kind of molded into a little bit different. So you still have white elitists, not necessarily called plantation owners anymore, but they were just they just gathered up all this land, bought it on the cheap during Reconstruction, and created things all over again.
Yeah,
But
they
then you had
created a different economic system that kept them on top. Yep.
right, and it kept them on top. So now you have poor white people living alongside poor black people doing sharecropping, but the white guys, they got paid maybe a few pennies more than the black people, so that kept them a step above. And
Right.
so now you have that whole disparity of, well, I'm white, I'm better than you, And if I want to make my life better than what it is right now, I need to do something about all these black people, you know. So there's the KKK and all the other stuff that went with it all the way up through the early part of the 20th century. You know, I'll give you another example. So I used to also live in a place, you know, my family actually, you know, goes back several, you know, about 3 or 4 generations in a place called Aroostook County, Maine. Okay. Now, it's as far north as you can get in the United States, outside of Alaska, without being in another country.
Right.
So, but it's also one of the most racially divided, most segregated counties in the United States. Okay. It rivals anything in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, but very few people know about it. Okay. And the thing is that the KKK was active up there up until the 1970s or better. I mean, active, as in running around doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And if you go up there today, I mean, now I spent my high school years up there. And the only reason we had any African American students, and we only had like 2 or 3, was because of the Air Force Base.
Right.
And their parents were sending them, you know, into our school, which was quite a bus ride. Okay. Now, the little town that was right outside the big Air Force Base up there, which is now closed, but you know, they were very diverse simply because of all of the military families there.
Right.
And it was extremely fictitious. Okay. There were always a lot of problems in that school, which is one of the reasons why their parents, you know, usually these kids were their parents were officers on the base, so they could afford to bus them or bring them into our town and let them go to school. But these kids were basically marginalized, segregated. They weren't allowed to participate in anything. And the other part of that is that marginalization in this country doesn't necessarily apply to just your skin color. And I say that only because I come from a very Irish family, and we were the only Irish family up there.
Right.
Even though, you know, my people went back 3 or 4 generations. When I was going to school, we were the only Irish family there. Everybody was divided evenly between the French Canadians and this Swedish colony that had been established in the late 19th century, and their descendants pretty much kind of took over a lot of things up there in just this one area. So again, they were evenly divided. And they fought each other left and right constantly. And with us, you know, my family being completely different, being Irish Catholic, definitely did not fit their role model. We didn't fit in with the French Canadian Catholics, and we definitely didn't fit in with the descendants of the Europeans, the Swedes, the English descendants, and all those people.
Right.
So there was a huge divide there when I was going to school. And, you know, here we are, you know, nearly 50 years later. And when I got out of the Army in 2005, I went home and I learned that things weren't quite as bad as they were back when I went to high school in the late 60s and early 70s, but it was still there. I mean, the racial divide between the French and everybody else was still there. Not quite as bad as it was, you know, back in the old days, but still, you know, it was very obvious if you knew what to look for.
Right.
And one of the things that I noticed was there were I mean, 0 African Americans living up there. Absolute 0. They had been pushed out. Okay. Once the Air Force Base closed up, obviously all the military personnel left. Once they left, that was it. And I found out that this was by design, that the people running the county up there did everything they could to not allow anybody else up there that they didn't like. That was just the way they ran things. And the state of Maine is kind of pretty evenly divided between the North and the South. So the southern half of the state is more diverse, a little more inclusive, and all that's great stuff. But once you get to what I call the northern half of the state, it is kind of evenly divided at Baxter State Park, Mount Katahdin. if you will. It's kind of like a demarcation point going east to west line, like almost like the Mason-Dixon line. And once you get north of that border, you'll find out quickly that no, there are no African Americans living north of that border. If there are, they're very, 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 very few. You could probably count them on one hand. And you're talking about 2 or 3 counties up there in the whole part of the state. And I thought to myself, what is going on in this, so-called modern age? We're supposed to be in the 21st century. And, I lived up there for 10 years and finally realized that no, I don't want to be a hermit up here anymore. But during those 10 years, I quickly learned that it's by design. I talked to, local wannabe politicians up there and, so on and so forth. And, big landowners, stuff like that. And they all told me the same thing, that we like things the way they are up here and we discourage. And that's the one guy told me, he's wanting to be vying to be a local politician. He told me this, he said it's kind of, we were in my repair shop. I ran a repair business up there, and we were talking in my shop one afternoon, and he told me straight up. He said, "This is by design. We don't want outsiders up here. We don't like people who we don't know, and we definitely don't like people with skin colors like they have down in Portland."
Right.
Portland, Maine is a big hub for a lot of African American refugees from Sudan and Ethiopia. And
Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia.
So that was a big deal up there in the northern part of the state. They didn't want any part of that. Oh no, can't have that up here. Oh no.
Right, and the by design is the right word. I mean, that's been true throughout the ages, right? So one of the things about Maine that I've only been to Maine a few times, but I did a project for a little while in Mount Desert Island, and so I learned before that project that anyone who's not from Maine and you come into Maine, you're from away, right?
That's right.
From away. But the funny thing was on Mount Desert Island, if you weren't born on the island and you had moved in, even from like the towns right across the mainland, you were from away because you weren't a true Mount Desert Islander. And it's like, oh my God, are you serious?
Yeah, no, Maine is extremely tribal. That's one of the things you'll realize. And that's, coming from my background, granted, I grew up there, so I didn't realize a lot of that stuff was going on until I left home.
Right.
Then I traveled all over the world. And when I went home again, I noticed it right away because I'm looking at it from an outsider's point of view.
Sure.
Now, in my case, my younger brother had lived up there all his adult life. So he was a local. Okay. Everybody knew him. You're right. So here I show up, 30 some odd years later, and all of a sudden I'm an outsider, even though I grew up there. But the only way that people knew me was that, oh, you're Raymond's brother. Oh, right. Hey, how you been? We haven't seen you in a while. Where you been? And then when they realized that I had been gone for 30 some years, I was from away. Okay. Right. I wasn't from from the county anymore because I've been gone too long.
Right.
I'm like, okay. You realize that my ancestors settled in this county. They said, oh, no, we don't care. You were gone for too long. We don't,
right.
You gotta win over our good graces again.
Right.
I'm like, seriously?
You gotta weather 3 decades of winters again in order to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I kind of quick stepped that by opening up a repair business. It was kind of a one of a kind business. So I had an in with that where people realized that, well, they had no choice but to call me because I was the only one that could help them.
Right. Yeah.
But that's not exactly the best way to do things.
No, it's not. One of the interesting things, and I knew bits and pieces of this before I started researching and writing, but I took a workshop like 6 or 7 years ago, and there was a question asked in the workshop, when did affirmative action begin? And I'm like, I put up my hand. Oh, I know when it was. It was like in the early 60s with John F. Kennedy. And he, in terms of if you wanted to work in the federal government, if you wanted to contract with the federal government, you needed to have affirmative action to hire more African Americans and other people of color. And it's like, no, affirmative action has been with us since this country was founded, right? It's like affirmative action for whites. If you look, so the rules and laws and the stuff that was designed in the Constitution and every other subsequent set of laws was to benefit whites. Now, early on, it was to benefit whites who owned land, white men who owned land. But gradually over time, it became if you were white. So like the Homestead Acts, I don't know if you're familiar with those that happened during Reconstruction, 99 point something percent of the beneficiaries of the Homestead Act, which was tens of millions of people over the course of about 100 years, but mostly the first 50 years, were white. It was just a few thousand African-American households that were able to get access to land. So all of a sudden, you have millions of white people who probably haven't accumulated much wealth yet, but they're able to move further out in western direction, right? Get their 10 acres or what have you, homestead it, and all of a sudden they have wealth that can be passed on from generation to generation. And then if you look at the New Deal during FDR's time, almost all of the legislation and laws written for New Deal were to benefit whites, but not really to benefit blacks, whether it was, a lot of black farmers that actually had eked out a living lost their farms during that time, whereas the laws helped a lot of white farmers stay in business. But the Social Security Act was designed so that if you were like a maid, or if you worked on a farm, which most African Americans did, they were not included in the Social Security Act. So they were intentionally excluded, right? And this is true for kind of all the programs that came out of the New Deal. The Civilian Conservation Corps, blacks got the low jobs on the totem pole, often didn't get offered jobs when whites were, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then the way we redlined our cities, right? And the way mortgages were issued, not to black people, right? It was not if they lived in a red line neighborhood. And so again, whites had the advantage. They were able to access mortgages. Blacks were not. And so again, there were all these really fundamental things that happened from after the Civil War up through the 1960s. The GI Bill was made very difficult for blacks to really benefit, black veterans to benefit from that in terms of accessing college education, in terms of, again, getting home loans. And so, these are fundamental things that really built the middle class in America, but it was predominantly the white middle class. And so when you think about, affirmative action that we created for African Americans starting in the 1960s, it was a pittance compared to all of the affirmative action programs that we had for whites for a century or more. So, every week as I was researching this book, it was just kind of a revelation of, I have to kind of reorient how I'm seeing this and learning it, because I didn't get taught this in high school history, right?
No.
It's none of this stuff is covered. You got to find it out yourself. You got to seek it out yourself, which is really why I continued to write the book. It's like, we all really need to understand this history better, to understand why we're dealing with still the racial issues that we have in America today, because we have fundamentally kept the playing field intentionally unlevel, right? So.
Yeah. Very true. And unfortunately, it took me leaving the country and traveling abroad to see that. My first real interaction was, the early to mid 70s. Now, all of a sudden, I'm thrust into a military environment where I've got a diverse group of people I'm working with of all colors, Filipinos, African Americans, Latinos. And I'm like, okay, Yeah, to me it was no problem because I mean I got beat up on and severely picked on and abused and bullied and you name it when I was going to high school. So I fit right in with you know, the so-called underprivileged, if you will. And I found out the military really didn't care. Okay. As long as you did your job, did what you were supposed to do when you're supposed to do it, nobody cared what the color of your skin was. Nobody cared about your background. They didn't care where you came from. As long as you could do your job, we all wore the same uniform. And I thought to myself, wow, this is pretty great. I can get along. I can do well here. And I made a career out of it. But, traveling to other countries, it's, one of the things that I noticed was that the United States, and it's even worse in the United States than it is probably in any other country I've ever visited, and that includes Great Britain. Not that I ever spent much time in Great Britain, but that's another story. Me and my background, there was the longest time that I would have got detained at Heathrow Airport if I even flew in there on a layover. So, but that's another
Right.
story. But the big thing is that when it comes to what I call the tribal mentality, the United States has it worse than any country that I've ever been to. Um, you know, and I'm like, why is that? And again, I learned that, after coming back and getting into things, that again, what we talked about earlier is by design. It's
Right.
here in this country. It is by design more so than any place else I've ever been across the world. And not that I haven't seen tribal mentality in other places, because in the Middle East, it's everywhere.
Right.
But despite all of that, I never have seen such racial segregation and on prominent display as much as I've seen it here in the United States. I think the closest I ever came to it was my last deployment when I went to Afghanistan, where you had the Pashtuns versus the Northern Alliance Dari Persian people. Um, that was the only really big divide in that country. But be honest with you, as long as everybody behaved and kept their mouth shut, nobody really cared. It was only the warlords and some of the politicians who cared whether you were a Pashtun or a Dari speaker or what have you. Okay. Other than that, nobody cared. Nobody in the villages cared. As long as you were a good neighbor out in some local village in Afghanistan, nobody cared.
Right.
See? And here in the United States, I find that there's a lot of truth to that too. It's a lot less than, but by and large, you find that a lot of people, regardless of their color of their skin or what have you, don't have a problem with living in a diverse neighborhood. Again, as long as everybody's willing to pull their weight, get along with each other, nobody causes any ruckus, and everybody's fine. Okay. Um, and unfortunately, we have a lot of governmental interference, what I call it, both from all the way from local all the way to Washington D.C. That would like to keep that divide going. A lot of it is, what I consider purely financial reasons. Um, a lot of people are making money off of that, so they want to keep it up, obviously, and
Yeah.
that's
And it works politically, right? I
and
mean
it
that
works politically because it's money for the politicians.
there's almost always been a racial boogeyman. Now it's the hordes that are supposedly overwhelming our
Right.
boundaries and coming here straight out of prisons in other countries, right? So
Yeah.
um, it's the Haitian immigrants that are
Eating
stealing pets
cats.
and eating them for dinner. It's
Yeah.
like it's a pattern that repeats itself in America.
Yeah.
It's every decade or every generation, it's some different group, but
Mhm.
there's always a group to, to other
Yeah.
and demean and try to make them the cause of all our problems.
Right. Yeah. And I blame it on capitalism. But that's a whole nother animal too. So listen, I'm gonna let cut this off here.
Okay.
Is there anything else do you want to give us here? I mean, my last question basically um, would be: do you see a possible change in the future of the United States?
around leveling the field,
Yeah.
around race relations. I mean, I guess, at some level right now for me, especially in a election year, it's hard to kind of get out of just treading water, right?
Yeah.
And in some ways, I wish elections happened every 6 years rather than every 4 years, because it feels like it never ends, because the campaign begins 2 years in, right?
Hmm.
Um, so here's what I do know. Things have gotten better since I was born. I was born in 1961. I grew up in an all-white town. It's still a pretty all-white town. I grew up in Connecticut, outside Hartford, Connecticut. Um, I think I have two biracial kids. They have an incredibly diverse set of friendships across race, across ethnicity, across religion,
Hmm.
right? So, it's kind of cliche to say, I look to the younger generation. They're not going to solve the things.
No.
There's a lot of issues that we need to figure out. One is, can we preserve our democracy?
Yeah.
It's a big question mark right now, right?
Right now. Yeah.
I think a second big question is, um, can we change our economic system so that it's not just run by pure corporate capitalists, right?
Yeah.
You know, I I I have a small business. You've had a small business. That is one piece of capitalism, right?
Hmm.
And it's like, to stay in business, you got to make money, but you're
Yeah.
serving customers who are local, and you're beholden to them, you're accountable to them.
Hmm.
Accountability kind of loses big time the further out you get and the bigger you get.
Yeah.
So we have to figure out how to create either a kinder, gentler form of capitalism that's married with a fundamentally better social safety system,
Hmm.
especially for kids, right?
Yeah.
Especially for kids. Um, with regard to race, I think one of the more interesting things happening right now. Uh, Gosh, what's his name? Bishop, Pastor Bishop, who's written a book called White Poverty, right? And
Mm.
he's trying to he's a black pastor, trying to pick up where Martin Luther King left off in
Hmm.
the 60s with a new poor people's campaign. And his whole idea is, we need to regenerate what he calls a moral fusion moment or movement that includes black people, Hispanic people, Asian people, white people, to
Hmm.
say, there's 150 million people who live at or near the poverty line in America,
Yeah.
of every color. And
Yeah.
we've got to do better for them. And a lot of the things that I talk about for solutions, it's primarily for African Americans, just because of what we subjected them to
Hmm.
for 2 centuries. But they're also ideas that, if we took them seriously, it could be, how do we do this for more than just African Americans, but more people that really need it?
Yeah.
Whether that's baby bonds, whether that's investing in higher quality schools, whether it's more generous financial aid to get to post secondary, whether it's trade schools or community college or
Hmm.
4 year, the whole 9 yards. A lot of what I wrote about is what we should be doing for African Americans, because we've intentionally left them behind for so long. But we've
Right.
intentionally left behind a lot of people,
Yeah.
right? And so, am I hopeful? Sort of. Do I think that if enough people kind of get this, that some more progress can be made? Absolutely. But at the same time, we have to be fighting the battle of not letting this country become more authoritarian and less democratic, right? And to
Right.
become more fair rather than less unequal, like you were talking about with the wealth gap. There's a major gap between whites and blacks in wealth. But even if you look across whites, it's vast as well.
Vast.
And
Yes.
how do we deal with that wealth gap in America? How do we really begin to bridge it, and reduce it?
Elect Bernie Sanders.
Hey, he's got some great ideas.
He does. He does. All right.
Well,
Well,
Terrence, I really appreciate you giving me the time here to just talk about these ideas And obviously, to put in a little plug for my books, I really appreciate you
Right. Yeah.
offering me that.
Well, it's not a debt. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try something here. I'm going to close out with, I'm going to try and um, show everybody your website.
Okay.
Hang tight. Let me kind of see if I can. Maybe.
Is there a way for me to share it? I can probably bring it up real quick. Or is it just you?
No, I'm going to try. I think I got it.
Okay.
There we go. I think. All right. So there's your website right there. So I'm just going to let everybody know that, if you want to know more about what he's doing, and you want to get involved with what he's doing, he's got newsletters, blog, books, all kinds of things. So if you want to know more about all of this, there's the website. Everybody can go see it. And we'll go from there.
Well, great, Terrence. Really appreciate your time. Really, I love the metaphor of the village oak tree. It's great to just kind of chew the fat under the tree for an hour. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Yep. Well, I appreciate you coming on. And I that's part of what I like to do here is have open discussions about these things. I'm not afraid to touch base on anything that's controversial. Obviously I don't want to deal with any radicals, but having honest discussions about the things that people don't want to talk about. Yeah, I'm all about that. And again, sitting underneath the in Irish, it's called a cronabia.
Right, I saw that on your website.
Yeah, that's basically what it's all about. To get the village underneath the tree, we talk about what's going on, the news of the world outside, good or bad, and kind of go from there. So I appreciate it, and I'm going to let you go, and we'll close it out for the day. And this will come out.
You said early October?
Yep. Okay.
Great. Can you just shoot me an email when it's out in case I lose track of the day?
I will do that.
Fantastic.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
So I appreciate Steve Brigham coming on and talking about all this controversial stuff. Again, a lot of good information here, a lot of eye-opening stuff, a lot of history. And we're both kind of history buffs on this. So for that, I appreciate it very much. So with that, I'll talk to you guys again next week. Sláinte. While I still have your attention, I want to tell you about how you can support this podcast and my efforts in general. This podcast will continue to remain free to subscribe to on all the major mobile podcast apps, on my YouTube channel, Krana Biha, and for the first 30 days on my Substack page, Krana Biha, the Tree of Life at Substack.com. With that in mind, I'm asking for donations of any amount. I decided that I would rather ask for donations instead of charging subscriptions, so everyone has an opportunity to watch or listen to this podcast everywhere in the world. All I'm asking for is help in defraying the cost to produce and distribute this podcast and maintain my website. I've set up a donation tab on the Village Oak Tree webpage at rss.com and a donation page on my website at www.cronabiha.com, which are all linked to PayPal for your security. This way you can use any currency you wish from around the world, providing PayPal is available to you. Any amount's appreciated. Now, about my website. The easiest way to find it is to copy it from the background behind me if you're watching this video. If you're listening to an audio version, copy the website name from the podcast logo shown. Search for it and enjoy your visit. Lastly, I'm trying to sell some copies of my book, Fugitives in the New United States, which can be found at major book retailers around the world, such as Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Lulu. You can also buy from me direct through the bookstore page on my website. Fugitives in the New United States is available in hardcover, paperback, and digital form. Free if you're a Kindle subscriber. It's written for young adults and older, so it's safe. If this were a movie, it would be rated PG. Look for Fugitives in the New United States at your favorite book retailer and enjoy it. If I sell enough, I'll find the time to write the second book in this series. So I want to thank you for your support, even if it's just a like and subscribe on my social media accounts. Thank you for listening to the show today. I hope you enjoyed it and you'll return again for another episode of the Village Oak Tree. Please like and subscribe and reply on the podcast videos or the audio podcasts where available. This helps with distribution around the world to anyone who may have an interest in the interviews and commentary I offer. I appreciate everyone, no matter where you are in the world, who watches or listens to these videos and podcasts. As I say goodbye this week, I wish to leave you with this Irish blessing as you go about your day. May your hand always be stretched out in friendship and never in want. Slán go foill.